Hi, everyone. My name is Sadie McGuire. I'm an OT capstone student at Children's Hospital New Orleans at the North Shore location, and this is our module on fine motor skill development. So, we're going to be covering anything from how to promote fine motor skills at home with your child if you have concerns about whether they're developmentally appropriate. And we're also going to be looking at the developmental trajectory and all of the components that make up the broader category of fine motor skills. Before we get started, I just want to take a moment to say stick around to the very end because there will be a QR code to a post survey that is really, really, really helpful for me to gather data about how helpful this module is for you guys. There's no identifying information collected about it. Um, and if you prefer to do it on a hard copy and you have a child at Children's Hospital, New Orleans at the North Shore location, you can ask your OT or any therapist for a hard copy that we can provide you. So without further ado, we'll get started. So why do fine motor skills matter? If your child is not necessarily developmentally age appropriate with stacking blocks or handwriting, why does it matter? Well, really, fine motor is a huge component of everything that we do in our daily lives. The muscle development and control of your hands and arms and upper extremities and upper body are all related to how you interact with the world and explore your environment. And that development doesn't happen if you're not interacting with your environment in an appropriate way or even at all. In a similar way, this creates the development of play skills and self care skills. So, as they gain the ability to have control over their fingers and their hands, they're able to increase the skills that they have for what we call activities of daily living. And for children, that includes play and self care. Hand eye coordination, which may seem common sense if you don't have good hands, the hand-eye coordination might not be there, but hand-eye coordination and visual motor skills are a huge part of everything that we do, even in our adult lives. Pre-writing and handwriting, this is often what most people think fine motor skills are is, oh, their handwriting's bad, they can't cut paper, things like that. And these problems come as a result of delays in fine motor skills before the developmentally appropriate age for handwriting, oftentimes. So, paying attention to what skills they're missing that make up handwriting is really important. And also, if they have trouble writing in school or keeping up with their friends I know kids don't write notes very much anymore, but if they have trouble with motor coordination in their hands, they might not be able to write, text, play video games, things like that. And that can cause later frustration as they feel behind their peers or unable to express themselves in some instances. So, body functions contributing to hand skills. It's not just, oh, my hand's there and it either works or it doesn't. There's a lot of pieces of your body that go into your ability to move your hands the way that you want them to. The first is somatosensory. So that's just that's a big word that means how your brain is interpreting sensory systems and how it's reading what the nerves are telling it about the world around you and responding to it with your muscles. So if you're going to pick up a big bucket, but you can see that the bucket's empty, you've learned through prior experience, oh, I don't need to really use that much energy and effort to pick this up. I'll just pick it up really quickly. But if you see that it's full of rocks, you're going to brace yourself, lift with your legs, not with your back, things like that, because you've learned through prior experience how to interact with that situation and the circumstances of that situation. And the way that we learn that is we interact with our environment through active touch. We're feeling things, we're playing with things, especially with kids. They learn how much force to use, how to manipulate things, which ways work and which ways don't. Um, Sensory integration also plays a role in hand skills. If a child is really hypersensitive and they're averse to feeling textures and other things because they're receiving too much sensory input and they're kind of in overload, they're not going to explore their environment. And that can create motor planning deficits similar to the somatosensory. component because they're not feeling their environment through active touch because of their hypersensitivity. Visual perception and cognition. Obviously, your vision guides fine motor skills because we see something, we say, oh, that's a piece of candy, I want it. Or like, that pillow looks super soft on my friend's couch. I'm going to reach out and pet it. And you learn what that fuzzy texture feels like. Um, and cognition influences your interest in it, your attention, and your curiosity. Like, oh, that pillow's really pretty. What does it feel like? Let me touch it. I don't think that I really like that texture. So those vision and cognition kind of go together. If there's a deficit in either of those body functions, there might be a deficit in hand skills as a result because they don't have that vision to say, I see this and I want to touch it, or the cognition to say, I'm actually interested in that and I want to learn more about it. Also, skeletal integrity. If their tone is really high and it's hard for them to move their body in a way that their brain wants it to, in a really precise, coordinated, efficient movement, it's just going to be a lot harder to explore their environment through active touch and create those motor plans and experiences for manipulation skills. So fine motor looks different depending on what phase of childhood your child's in. As an infant, they're playing with rattles, they're reaching and grabbing things at midline, like they're holding a block at their chest or their bottle at their chest if they're helping to hold a bottle while they feed. And they're beginning to finger feed and pick up little pieces of food and bring it to their mouth. And that's kind of what's really important to an infant with regards to fine motor skills. But a toddler has different needs. They've started to use utensils most likely. And they'll be playing with toys more with more manipulatives and using their hands to feel things and explore things and move things around versus just hold things and look at it as a baby would do. Also, they're starting to build those foundations of dressing and self-care skills, like we talked about in the earlier slide, how all those fine motor skills build into tasks that you'll do even into adulthood, and the foundation for that starts in toddlerhood. In preschool, schoolwork begins. So they're stringing beads, they're doing crafts, they might do art, painting, all that's fine motor. They might start learning how to write letters. Scissors are introduced. Scissors are often an area where kids might be a little delayed in because teachers don't like to give a class of 12 kids scissors and let them loose. So they haven't had the practice. They haven't had that somatosensory experience to create the motor plan so their brain can say, oh yeah, this is how we use scissors. This is how the most efficient way for our hand to be. This is how much force to use, how to move smoothly to cut out these shapes. And then by preschool, they should be mostly dressing themselves and have a lot of the good skills for dressing, obviously, barring some help from mom or dad. So when we're specifically talking about the hand and fine motor, there are 34 muscles in each hand. So that's 68 muscles in your hands total. If you look at the picture below, each of those four quadrants is a different layer of muscles. So the one that has a lot of bones in the bottom right corner, that is the innermost layer. So if you strip away all the muscle layers, that's what you get at the very, very insides of your hand. And you can see those tiny little muscles. And then as the pictures progress and more layers are added, you can see how many small muscles there are that are controlling all of the different movements that your fingers can make. And you have to develop those muscles. You're not born with big biceps or big quads that can run and jump and play. You're born as a chubby little baby. So the same thing is true in your hands. You have to use them and develop those muscles over time. These are the muscles that help to create the arches of your hands. If you look at your palm, the lines that a palm reader might read, those follow generally the arches in your hands that help you reach and grasp things. If you pretend like you're reaching out for a cup, you can see how those muscles are supporting that arch within your hand. And that's a really important movement that is an example of why the development of these muscles is so important. So, as I've mentioned earlier, fine motor is so much more than handwriting and cutting and a pincer grasp. There are different types of fine motor skills, And each skill requires different underlying skills and abilities for that to even be able to happen. So we're just going to quickly go over some of this. It might be a little overwhelming. And if it is, you can just tune your brain out for the next couple minutes. Um, I mostly just wanted to touch on these to show how many different parts of fine motor there are. And when your child is in OT for a fine motor delay, we're assessing and addressing all of these different things that build on top of each other with dozens of other skills to create these main skills. So reach and carry, to be able to reach and carry something, you need to be able to see and have a midline orientation. So you need to be able to tell where the middle of your body is and be able to reach past it or across it, which is a skill that you don't develop, you're not born with, you develop it over time. Um, you need to be able to do a symmetric, which babies initially, when they start to carry things, they carry with two hands and their arms move symmetrically, and then they develop to be able to carry something with one hand. You need to be able to move smoothly and have the force that you use with your muscles needs to be able to be graded and really smooth and nice, because if you have a cup of water, you don't want to have jerky movements and you're carrying that across the room. You need to be able to rotate at your shoulder and adjust based on feedback. There's different types of grasp patterns, and grasp is just how you're holding something. So a reflexive grasp is what a baby has, where they're kind of like using their whole fist and they're like raking Cheerios into their hand. And then a lot of people have seen a baby shove the Cheerios into their mouth with the palm of their hand and the Cheerios get stuck all over their face. That's a raking grasp, and it's a reflex that they have essentially, and it's not very skilled, as you can see by the Cheerios all over their face. It's not very efficient. But as they begin to have different experiences, that develops into a wide variety of patterns. So they can change their approach for the size of the object. The way that you pick up a hammer with that grasp using your whole fist is going to be very different than the way you pick up a singular Cheerio with just your thumb and first finger. In hand manipulation is if you have something in the palm of your hand, like you have a key, someone puts a key in the palm of your hand, you can use your fingers to get it into your fingertips to unlock a door without having to use your other hand to help you. So that's palm to finger. And then you can also pick up something small and then transfer it to your palm with finger to palm translation. You can shift up and down on an object like a pencil, and you can rotate an object in your hand. Like if you have that key and you're like, oh, I'm sticking the wrong end out, it's not going to unlock the door, I need to flip it around. You can flip that around without using your other hand to help. Voluntary release is a skill that you are not born with. A lot of babies will hold on to things forever until their hand just relaxes and it automatically falls out. Um, when they're learning the skill, often they'll stabilize their wrist on the edge of the container that they're dropping something into. But as they get older and experience different things, they are able to refine that release pattern so that they can do things like stacking a block. You can't just all or nothing, splay your fingers out, release whenever you're stacking blocks. You need to let go very slowly so that your tower won't fall over. As we were talking about before with the reach and carry, bilateral hand use develops over time because at first it's symmetric and then it's reciprocal, which is where you use one hand then the other, like when you're walking and your arms are swinging. And then simultaneous manipulation, where you can do two with one thing with two hands, and then you can differently use two hands. And finally, tool use. So you're using a tool like a writing utensil, scissors, an eating utensil, and you change how you use that tool and your grasp and your manipulation and your bilateral hand use is all different based on the specific tool that you're using. So if your child is kind of clumsy with their fingers and they're not very good at stacking blocks, they're falling a little behind in their developmental milestones for fine motor, it might be because there is part of the developmental continuum of hand skills that is missing. You can't just jump straight to the problem and address that skill that's lacking. There might be skills before there that we need to build upon because one skill leads into the other one. So first, a baby, like we talked about, is going to be using symmetrical movements. They're going to be using both their arms at the same time to carry something. And whenever they are reaching towards something, their whole arm and their whole hand are involved in that at the same time. And so as they start to play and experience their world, they'll be able to isolate arm and hand movements, meaning they're just moving the very specific joint, like the wrist or the finger or the elbow, that they want to accomplish the task. Then they can start to reach for things, carry things, hold things, manipulate them in their hand. And then bilateral hand use comes after those two skills. Once those three foundational skills are acquired, then they can start to generalize their skills to adapt to new situations and requirements. Where, like we mentioned earlier, there's different tools, there's a big heavy bucket versus a light bucket versus a pillow, and the way you approach all of those things and how your hand looks when you reach towards them or go to interact with it is going to be different, because your brain says, oh, that's how we reach for a pillow. We're going to probably need to grab the corner of it, because if I just reach towards the middle, there's nothing to grab. And so you learn how to interact with things like that. What a lot of parents have fine motor concerns with is handwriting. And so this is just to touch on the types of grasp for handwriting. The ages listed are the general milestones that these um, grasps develop, but many kids, depending on their experiences, might run a little behind, or they might even be super early. Like sometimes they'll be a 2-year-old with a static tripod grasp, and that's a good thing. Parents don't need to go back and develop a quadrupod grasp before that, before encouraging the static tripod. So generally, it's a pincer grasp. So they're either doing that raking movement, or not either. They are doing the raking grasp with the Cheerios mentioned earlier, until they start to learn to isolate that thumb and first finger where they can pick up peas, Cheerios, puffs, um, and they're able to have a lot more precision with that. Then they can start to manipulate a writing utensil around a year-ish old with the palmar supinate grasp. It's basically just a big old fist, and it's the stereotypical kid scribbling on paper, toddler on the wall, arm movement. They're using their whole arm and their whole shoulder, and they're just really getting into it and scribble, 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 scribble. Um, that develops into a digital pronate grasp where their wrist is turned, so their thumb is facing down. Um, this gives them a little bit more control. So they're able to start to copy vertical, horizontal, and circular lines. Diagonal lines develop a little bit later, so don't be concerned if your child can do all the other shapes, but not a triangle. Then comes quadrupod, where they're holding it in their fingertips like eventually you will for the most efficient grasp with the dynamic tripod. But with a quadrupod, all four fingers and thumb are on the pencil. And it might not look exactly like this picture. It's just they're holding it in their fingertips, but they're using all of their fingertips to stabilize that pencil. And all of their arm movements come from the wrist. So with the palmar supinate, they're scribbling with their whole arm. And then by the time they get to the quadrupod, they're able to keep their elbow and their shoulder still and can just use their wrist. The static tripod, they're getting a little bit more control, and they have three fingers on the end of the pencil, and they can move all three fingers as one. And by the time you get to the dynamic tripod, you're bracing on your second finger and using your index and your thumb, or you're bracing on your middle finger and using your index and your thumb to really efficiently and precisely control the pencil to make small letters, big letters. This is the mature grasp that we want to see our kids develop eventually as it's age appropriate. Since fine motor plays into dressing skills, this is just kind of general milestones for dressing. By the time that they're a year and a half old, they should be able to take off their socks and shoes, kind of help you by pushing their arms and legs through their pants or shirt, and they should begin to undress themselves. By 2 years to 3 years, they can get undressed, but you might have to help them unbutton their pants or unbutton their shirt, do a zipper, and they can help pull up their pants. By 3 to 4 years, they can undress themselves even with the fasteners, and they're able to snap, unbuckle, and zip. But whenever they are zipping something up, they might need help connecting the two sides first. That's a little tricky manipulation of fine motor. So if you connect it for them, they'll be able to zip it up. And then by 4 to 5, they can buckle, zip, do their socks and shoes, and they can tell the front and back of clothing. Typically, they should be able to dress themselves fully by 5 years old. And if your child has a delay in fine motor skills, they might not be doing these dressing skills as these milestone years suggest. And this is just to show you the continuum of how it develops. So if your child is not able to do one thing, you might need to step back on the continuum and address the skills below that to make sure they're really strong and foundational before they move on to the older milestone skills. These are just some very general fine motor milestones. At the end of the lecture, there will be a QR code that will take you to a document that has helpful links and some reference materials if you want to know more about anything in the presentation today. And it also includes a much more in-depth fine motor milestone chart. If you really want to get into what should my child be doing at this age, I do encourage you not to get stressed out if your child isn't 100% at the fine motor level of their developmental age. Um, if you're watching this video, they probably are in therapy of some sort and they're working on developing those skills. So, this is just kind of a guideline of the order that different skills develop because it shows you how those skills that we were talking about at the beginning of the presentation need to have building blocks for each other. And you can't develop this skill of scribbling without being able to reach, have a pincer grasp, things like that that build on each other. At Also in the link at the end of the presentation, there is a link to a website that will take you to a chart that looks like this. This is a screenshot from that chart. The first column on the left is the age, the second column is the milestones, and the third column is what implications for those milestones are. For example, in the 3 to 4 years, those are the milestones they should be able to do. But if they're not doing those, it might result in delayed pre-writing skill development. They might avoid pencil-based tasks, things like that. So it can just kind of give you an idea of how each age's fine motor skills impacts other things that they should be doing and things that you might see in their life. Um, Motor problems often are associated with impaired hand skills just because there's so many different systems and skills that feed into the development of fine motor abilities. So if you have poor fine motor skills, it might be because of related motor problems, or poor fine motor skills might cause related motor problems. So some of that looks like bilateral integration and control. So how do your two hands move together? If you're not able to move your hands together, it might be because you haven't experienced things with your hands and explored things and developed that skill. If you have trunk instability, your trunk needs to be stable, your core needs to feel secure before you're going to explore with your hands. And so a child with trunk instability is not going to explore with their hands as much as a child with a more stable trunk. If you've developed compensatory movement patterns as a result of a condition like CP or an injury, that can impact your muscle memory for how to do certain tasks. Inadequate movement isolation, if you're not able to, your brain's not able to tell one single finger to move, that's going to make it really hard to develop fine motor skills. Also, poorly graded movement, all or nothing, like that release that we were talking about earlier, where you're releasing the block, but your fingers are just splaying out because you can't grade that movement and just slowly release. Also, if you have limited movement pattern variety and you don't have different abilities to pick up something in a very specific way for that tool, like this is how I pick up the scissors with my fingers in the holes, this is how I pick up a pencil where my fingers grip at the bottom, that's going to impact your hand skills because you're not able to generate those patterns. And that doesn't mean that they'll never be able to do these things if they have one of these motor problems listed. It just means it's something that your therapist is probably considering when they're looking at your child's abilities. One of the best things that you can do for fine motor development is let your child try things on their own. When they're dressing, playing, exploring different things. I know you can be in a hurry and you're like, oh, come on, we've just got to get out of the house. And that's one thing. But if you have a couple minutes, let them try to put their shoes on, let them try to put their clothes on. If they're trying to open something, let them try for a few minutes until they ask for help or offer help after a few minutes. But don't just jump in and be like, oh, we're going out of the house. Let me put your shoes on, because that takes away the experiences that they need to develop the motor skills and refine those muscles in their hand. This is a list of some things that you can do to improve fine motor skills at home. And this is all through play. We're not trying to tell you you need to be sitting with your child having therapy 2 hours a week. I mean, 2 hours a day, every single day, drilling at home. These are just play things that you can provide that will help them to develop those skills just by the activities that they're already playing with. There's also lots more lists and ideas on the helpful links doc that is listed at the end of this presentation. So there's Play-Doh. There's tons of different things you can do with Play-Doh that encourage fine motor manipulation and things like that. I love using a spray bottle. Those small muscles in your hand that squeeze are used for lots and lots of different fine motor skills, and a spray bottle helps to strengthen those muscles. So a lot of times I'll take them out to the sensory garden and I'll say, we're going to water our plants with the spray bottle. And kids love it, and it's really, really good for their fine motor. If you can create any games with tweezers, clothespins, tongs, that's going to strengthen those little hand muscles as well. Manipulating small cards, buttons, doing puzzles, that's also incorporating visual motor skills. If you have blocks, Legos, magnetiles, those magnetic tiles that like stick together and build things, and other building games, that's really good for visual motor skills as well as fine motors. Also, lacing beads, pipe cleaners, stringing games, that helps with bimanual coordination using both hands because you're holding the string while you put the bead on with your other hand. Stickers, painting, ripping and crumpling paper, pouring and scooping, picking up with tongs, etc., in a sensory bin. So if your child already has a sensory bin that they love to play with, add in a cup and a spoon and a shovel and tweezers and things that will encourage them to experiment with utensils and things like that. As you're trying to promote fine motor skills at home, here's just a couple things to remember. If your child is old enough to write, gently encourage the correct grasp of them, of their writing utensils. So don't sit there and hound them and say, pick up your thing right, fix your hands, fix your hands. But if you notice it every now and then, just either take your hand and adjust their hand, or if they know the correct grasp, say, look at your fingers, what are your fingers doing? Just to kind of start building that muscle memory of the correct way to hold a utensil. Obviously, if your child is 3 or 4, that's not really a super big concern at that point, and you're just trying to get them to color, color, color. You can draw vertical, horizontal lines and try to get them to imitate you, um, depending on their age. You can use the grasp development um, slide as a reference for at what age you should start trying to correct your child's grasp. You should also ensure optimal positioning of your child if they're having difficulty with fine motor tasks. Like we talked about earlier, if your trunk isn't supported, then you're going to have a much harder time with manipulating and doing really precise movements with your arms and hands. So if they are flopped all over and they seem a little unstable in their chair, it's too big, they can't really fit well where they're sitting, that could be a way to support their fine motor performance, is look at the seat that they're sitting in. If their arm keeps getting tired due to a disability or positioning issues, you can support that upper arm so that they can just use their hand. They also need to be able to be regulated to learn from their experiences. So when you are exploring your environment and creating motor patterns and motor plans and learning different movement patterns, if you are dysregulated, you're not actually learning those things and learning how to modulate force and respond to your environment, because you are just trying to process the world around you in a way that doesn't feel like fight or flight. If this is new information to you, then I really encourage you to watch the sensory processing lecture posted here as well. If you're really concerned about handwriting, You can ask your therapist about pencil grips, adapted paper, and spacing guides for them to use at school or when they're writing at home. When you're working with your child on handwriting, emphasize going top to bottom for letter formation. Like with a T, you would draw the stick of the T from the top to the bottom, not from the bottom to the top. And remember that vision and visual processing skills play a significant role in handwriting. So if you're having problems with your child's handwriting, it could be a fine motor issue, but there are other things that could be at play. So it's important to consider all these different elements. And your child's therapist is considering all of those elements. So if you have any questions, you can always ask your child's OT about what they think, what they recommend, what specific things they've noticed, and what they're working on. Here is that link to the Google Doc that has lots of more information, more developmental milestone charts, fine motor activities, things like that. And then please, please, please take my survey. It will take you like 5 seconds. There is nothing that you have to write if you don't want to. There is one open ended question, but everything else is just click, click, click. And then you can be on your merry way. And I will be so thankful, eternally thankful to you for filling that out. If you have any questions, feel free to ask your child's OT. And thank you for watching.